So hello and welcome everyone to our final event this year in celebration of Disability History Month here at the University of Wolverhampton. My name's Julian Gwinnett and I'm one of the four co-chairs of the university's Disabled Staff Network. And I'm delighted today to welcome Judith Potts, who's the founder and trustee of Esme's Umbrella, Jonathan Ward, Development Manager for Employment at the Thomas Pocklington Trust, and Jennifer Carpenter, who will be talking to us about her lived experience of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So today's talk is called What is Charles Bonnet Syndrome? And it will cover an explanation of what Charles Bonnet Syndrome is, why it happens, and how to find support. And also the need for the NHS to create a pathway for diagnosis and treatment. So just before we start the session, just to let you know that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please feel free to type those in the Q&A box, and we will read those out at the end of this session. And there's also the chat available for anyone who wants to add a comment during the talk. So now let me hand you over to Judith to begin today's session.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here and talking to you. Yes, my charity is called Esme's Umbrella, and the first questions I'm always asked are, why the umbrella and who on earth is Esme? Well, when I decided that something needed to be done to raise awareness of Charles Bonnet syndrome, I chose the logo of an umbrella to shelter everyone who develops this very disturbing condition. And Esme, well, Esme was my mother, and it was because of her experience that all this has actually happened. She was in her early 90s, lived a very independent life, cooked for herself, looked after herself generally. She had an eye disease called glaucoma, but in those days I knew nothing at all about sight loss and had no idea how much sight she'd actually lost, because apart from anything else, she was very good at compensating. She completed correctly the Telegraph cryptic crossword every day, which is more than I can do, and seemed to be fine until one day I was leaving her flat and she suddenly said, "I do wish these people would get off my sofa." Well, of course, there was no one sitting on her sofa. And while I took a deep breath, thinking, what on earth am I going to say to this? She said, "And there's a child dressed in Edwardian clothes that follows me everywhere, and a hideous gargoyle-like creature that jumps from table to chair. And sometimes the whole room or my garden morphs into an alien place." Well, of course, I had absolutely no idea what could possibly be wrong with her. But there's no doubt that at that moment, the word dementia was hanging in the air between us. But I thought about that Telegraph cryptic crossword and I thought, she can't possibly have dementia. What on earth can this be? So I said, "Well, are you all right if I go?" And she said, "Yes, no, I'm fine. They're my visions that I call them, but I just wish they'd go away. They're very interruptive of my life." So I went away and with the most enormous piece of luck found buried in the health pages of a newspaper a tiny paragraph about a condition which develops after sight loss, and it was called Charles Bonnet syndrome. So I thought, brilliant. Now we know what this is. I called her, said, "Don't worry, I will speak to your ophthalmologist tomorrow." And that is where it all went wrong, because her ophthalmologist refused to discuss Charles Bonnet syndrome, to the extent that at her next eye appointment at the hospital, he sent his junior with strict instructions not to discuss it. Her GP said, "Well, she's got dementia." I said, "No, she hasn't." Her optometrist never heard of it. So I went back online and discovered Professor Dominic Fitch at King's College London. And he is the world authority on visual hallucinations of all types and the first person to research CBS, as we call it for short. So I went to see him. He said, "Yep, this is what Esme has got." And he explained to me why it happens. So when you have full sight, there are messages which run all the time from the retina in the eye to the visual cortex in the brain. The eye acting like a camera and the brain interpreting what you're seeing. As sight diminishes and the amount of sight that is needed before CBS kicks in, we now know is different with everybody. We used to think it was over 60% of sight, but now we realize that every single person's experience of CBS is different. So when whatever amount of sight is required to have been lost happens, the brain is left with very little or possibly nothing at all to interpret. So instead, it fires up and creates its own images, taking from your memory bank of images a particular image. Why it chooses whatever it might be, a bunch of flowers or something very frightening, we don't know. We do know that CBS is made worse by isolation, stress, fever, tiredness, and some medications, but I'll come on to that later. So anecdotally, we understand that if someone is under great stress, it is worse. Now, during the COVID lockdowns, it became very clear that people with CBS were having a particularly difficult time. And that we discovered was due to the isolation and to partly the stress of worrying about whether you were going to catch COVID and what was going to happen to you. And for people who were living on their own, they had the double isolation, the isolation of being literally on their own, and the isolation of being alone with the visual hallucinations. And these visual hallucinations are silent. So no other sense is involved at all. They're totally silent, but they're very, very vivid. So if you have a little sight left, it's terribly difficult to live with this condition because you just don't know whether the car parked on the pavement in front of you is real or not. Now, obviously, you know if a tiger appears, a tiger is a very common hallucination, then that definitely isn't real, but it doesn't stop you being very frightened, and your fight or flight mode goes into action, and sometimes people fall over. And the one thing that we know as well is that not enough doctors are aware of CBS. So if you fall over due to a tiger or a truck or whatever it is that you hallucinated, you will end up probably at the GP or the hospital doctor, neither of whom will have heard of CBS. So even if you say, look, I hallucinated this tiger and it just made me fall over, it's because I have Bonnet syndrome, they will send you to the psych. And that is something that we're trying very hard to educate them not to do, because it's, first of all, an incredible waste of NHS resources, and secondly, much more distressing for the person involved. So we are trying our very best to educate as many people as we possibly can. We know very recently we have discovered that for some people, a sound can trigger the hallucination. And we know this because I was approached by an habilitation officer who is working with an 11-year-old child who was refusing to go into the music room at school because he was hallucinating every time he went in. And the staff of the school were saying he was behaving badly and being disobedient. And the habilitation officer said to me, but surely a child of 11 wouldn't know about CBS, with which I entirely agreed. And then Professor Dominic Fitch told me that this tiny piece of research has pointed to some people finding their hallucinations occur after a particular sound. And I assume in this case of the 11-year-old child, it must have been a musical instrument or something in that particular room. Every single person, as I have said, is different. Coping with this condition is very hard, and Jennifer will explain to you how she does it. On my website, which is www.charlesbonnetsyndrome.uk, you will find all sorts of information, but you will also find some suggested distraction techniques. We know that if you try and distract your brain from the hallucination by doing something else. It can be something very simple, like clicking your fingers, clapping your hands, brushing the hallucination away from you, stretching out towards it, doing something else which uses another pathway in the brain, for some people, that will switch off the hallucination for the time being. It is not a cure because it'll come back, but it will help at that moment. This doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't work for people who have CBS every waking hour. And we know there are actually more than I thought originally. These we need to try and find ways to help. And I think things like breathing techniques and relaxation are very good, but CBS absolutely loves it when you are quite dozy, almost about to go to sleep, or you go into a sort of trance when you're a passenger in a car and you have no sight or very little sight. You can't drive the car, you can't admire the view. And unless someone is talking to you all the time, you are in a kind of trance-like state. CBS loves that, leaps into action immediately. And for some reason, when people are passengers in a car, I think it's the movement of the car that does this, they report enormous animals coming towards them, or a huge truck about to crash into them, or gigantic waves coming over the top of them. So it is very frightening and very alarming when you're a passenger in a car. Well, it's alarming at any time, but particularly when you are in that kind of position. We do know as well from work by Professor Dominic Fitch that if someone is given a warning before that first hallucination appears, the outcome for that person is so much better. So what happens is, as soon as the hallucination appears, they don't instantly think they are losing their mind. They think, oh yes, I was warned this might happen, keeping themselves calmer and more able to cope. So I have been asking all kinds of doctors, GPs, ophthalmologists, plus social workers, rehabilitation officers, nurses, anybody who works with people to ask the question, very gently ask the question, has anyone talked to you about Charles Bonnet syndrome? Or if the person has had sight loss for some time, then it's obviously, do you ever see things that aren't there? Because they're not real. And try to help. Now, as people get much older, into their sort of late 80s, early 90s, it becomes more difficult for them to understand that what they're seeing is not real. Even though they might have understood this earlier on in their life, it then becomes so much more difficult for them. And that makes it very hard for whoever's looking after them, whatever carer. We also know, and this year we have concentrated on children with CBS, and we also know now that for children, it is as difficult as it is for the very elderly, because of course, children see horrific things like, for them, like witches or horrible great bugs or spiders on their beds, which means that a trusted adult has to be with them until they fall asleep and get up in the night and go to them if they wake up, because as you wake up, very often CBS will show you something in front of you. And for the children, it is very, very hard. So we have done a piece of research to prove that children do develop CBS. Professor Maria Musaji at Moorfields and Dr. Lee Jones, who's a psychologist, they have worked together and they have proved that children do develop CBS. We are now working to find out how many. And judging by the Stargardt's conference that both Jonathan and I attended a couple of weeks ago, many, many more children than we realized. And it's so important to find ways to help them and to make them feel they can talk about it. There is a wonderful guy called Miles Northwood who now works for guide dogs, and he developed CBS when he was 4. He lost his first eye through cancer and then the second eye through cancer. So when he was 4, he developed CBS. He told no one. And I think the reason children don't tell their parents is that their parents are already upset because they've discovered that their child has sight loss. And the child knows that and doesn't want to make them feel even worse, so they keep quiet. So he said nothing. When he was 7, he did tell a 7-year-old friend, and he saw these horrific monsters. So he and his 7-year-old friend fought the monsters together. Then, of course, you get to your teenage years where you're absolutely not going to say anything about monsters to anybody. When he was 48, Miles read something that I had written, and he contacted me. And he said, I am still seeing these monsters. They have red eyes and green heads, and they're just horrific, and they kind of leer. He said, do you think this is CBS? And I said, well, yes, because you are obviously totally of sound mind, as Charles Bonnet himself wrote about his grandfather. So yes, I do. And I said, I do hope, the family are being supportive. And he said he'd never told anyone, not even his wife. Now he has, and life is much, much better for him. He still has the hallucinations, but he can at least talk about them. He's done a wonderful video about what it was like when he was a child living with CBS. And when I heard his story, that is when I realized that we needed to do something for the children, because we cannot have children living. It's bad enough for adults, but we cannot have children living in these frightening worlds of hallucinations without any help or support. So we are working hard on that. As far as support for the adults are concerned,
11:21 a.m.
before COVID, we had around the country, run by local low vision charities, we had support groups who were face-to-face, and they really helped. They would reassure each other that what they were seeing wasn't real, that it wasn't a mental health condition, that it was purely something that happens when you lose your sight. And then along came COVID, and they all had to close. So as I said before, when I discovered that people during lockdown were having such a terrible time, we asked the same local low vision charities and more if they would introduce telephone or online support groups. And this is what a lot of them did. Now, then after COVID, a great number of them closed because they simply didn't have enough money to run them. So at this moment, we do have some. And I have an assistant called Luke, and he looks after all of those. So if you are interested in any of them, let me know, and Luke will contact you. While I'm talking about Luke, he also runs our membership, which is free. If anyone would like to be a member, if you have sight or if you don't have sight, if you have CBS or if you don't have CBS, that's all fine. There will be a newsletter coming out just before Christmas, and we keep everyone up to date. Please let me know if you would like to join, and Luke will do that for you. So instead of asking charities that simply can't afford to run a support group, we have CBS champions, which means that they have a badge like the one I'm wearing, if everyone can see that. It is just for those without any sight, it's a little badge, and it has the umbrella on the top, and it says here to help, and it has the website address at the bottom. And these will be very helpful because at least people can go and talk to them in the local low vision charities or in the social services, and the sensory workers are amazingly good. And certainly the ones in Essex have all volunteered to do home visits for me if I need, which is I do need desperately, someone to go to a person's home and just talk to them gently about CBS. So if anyone is watching who comes from any of the other sensory services around the country, if your people would like to do that too, I would be enormously grateful. There is no CBS specific medication. If the hallucinations are particularly bad, then medication for epilepsy or dementia can be prescribed. This does not mean the person has developed either of those conditions. It's simply that some of those medications can help to switch off the hallucinations, not all the time, but it does help a little bit. However, of course, those medications have very unpleasant side effects. So people tend not to go down that route. They try to find a distraction technique or something which helps them. Medications which people take for other conditions can make CBS worse. And the worst culprit is a proton pump inhibitor called omeprazole. So anything that ends in prazole has as its side effect visual hallucinations. So obviously, if you already have CBS, taking omeprazole or one of its sister drugs will give you a double whammy of visual hallucinations. There is an alternative, and if you think someone or yourself this is having the effect of making CBS worse, please go to the GP, but please print from my website the letter which explains CBS, just in case the GP doesn't know what it is, because I'm afraid there are still far too many who are in ignorance. The one thing that I did do a couple of years ago is working with a very eminent ophthalmologist here, Professor Andrew Dick, and another in America, Dr. August Kohlenbrander. I just love that name. We approached the World Health Organization, and they agreed to give Charles-Bonnet syndrome its first code in the Taxonomy of Diseases and Conditions, ICD-11. However, they refused to remove the word temporary when describing the condition, and we know it is not temporary for everybody. So I will have to go back, but at least it is there, which means that all the health providers throughout the world, the NHS here, really have a duty of care to everybody with CBS to create a proper pathway for diagnosis and treatment. And at the moment, they're not. I have had various written questions asked in the House of Commons, one only a couple of weeks ago, to discover that Stephen Kinnock, who is the new Minister for Social Affairs, I think, social care, replied to me with absolutely no understanding of CBS whatsoever. So my plan for next year is to take this to Parliament, because we need it really taken so much more seriously than it has been up to now. We have some research, tiny bit of research, but this is the only country in the world that is doing this research, and it's only because I kicked all the researchers into action, and I will keep kicking. The University of Oxford, the Nuffield Centre for Neurosciences, has taken the tiny bit of research that Dr. Kat de Silva Morgan did at the University of Newcastle, where she discovered that people with sight loss and CBS had more excitable brains than those with sight loss who don't develop it. Whether that excitability was always there or whether CBS has put it there, we don't know. We hope that this research that Professor Holly Bridge at the University of Oxford has been doing, which will be published very soon, we hope that might tell us, is there a higher pathway? Are images held somewhere? What we do know from her work is that there is a chemical change in the brain before the hallucination appears. And this was borne out by 2 guide dogs who are warning their owners before their hallucination appears. They put their heads on their owner's lap and they stay there until they know the hallucination has gone. So I approached Dr. Claire Guest, who runs the medical detection dogs. I told her about CBS and I said, do you think these dogs are doing this? And she said, oh, yes, because there will be a medical change in the body, a chemical change in the body, sorry, which will make the odor of the skin change. And that is what those dogs can detect when they are looking after people with diabetes or Addison's disease or epilepsy. Before a seizure or an episode, the chemical change in the body changes the odor of the skin. So that's very exciting. And the medical detection dogs are beginning work now to find out at what point before the hallucination appears does the odor of the skin change. And there are various other pieces of research, a lot of social research at Anglia Ruskin University, London City, Aston, all sorts of places. If there's anybody here at Wolverhampton University who would like to do some research, that would be great. I train the nurses at Manchester University who are fully trained nurses but want to do an ophthalmic nursing degree as well. If any of the nurses at Wolverhampton who are training would like me to train them, I would be honoured to do so. So I think that's probably it from me. There is a lot more, but we don't have the time. So I am now going to hand you over to Jennifer Carpenter, who I have known for many years, one of the very first people that I met who lives with Bonnet syndrome. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. Well, I'm Jennifer. For the first 38 years of my life, I was a fully sighted, normal, functioning person. Over a 3-week period in the 90s, when my child was just coming 4, I was arranging his birthday. I started seeing all sorts of weird things on the television screen. The world looked very strange. I got myself up to Moorfields and was told I had an eye condition. I actually have a very rare genetic disease, and part of it is going blind. So I was registered blind, and I never met a blind person. I didn't know anything about the world of disability, but suddenly my husband, my 4-year-old, and myself were in it. I live with CBS every day. It actually got me in 2015. So probably for 20 years, I knew about it. I read about it, but I didn't have it. And when it turned up with a vengeance. I have seen the most amazing hallucinations, actually. The very first thing that turned up were electricity pylons. My husband and I were down in Hampshire with some friends for the weekend. We were out walking across the fields, and there was all these pylons, which you tend not to get. I live in southwest London near Wimbledon. And suddenly they turned up in my living room, crawling their way up the wall. And that was just the start of it. I was seeing Victorian people. I was seeing children playing hoopla across my living room. I remember once getting to the top of the staircase, which turned into a waterfall. So at that point, you decide not to go down the waterfall. I've had frogs in the house that would have like green trousers on, but they were very brightly colored, and they were holding up lots of balloons. So when they turned up, they would disappear up through the ceiling. One of the worst things I've had is I actually went into medieval world. I was down at Southfields with my husband. I belonged to Metro Blind Sport, and my husband was running archery as a volunteer once a month. And within about the first few weeks, we were driving in the car through Southfields, but we weren't. It wasn't a London street. I was on this country road with stone walls. There were medieval castles. The sea was there, weird looking trees. And I said to my husband, where are we? This is not the right way to the leisure centre. And of course, people think you're bonkers at first. Went down to the leisure centre, setting up for archery. And there was all sorts of weird things happening on the walls. We came out of there. We decided we would go to Moorfields to see what on earth was happening. So we went there. They had a look at me. Oh, no, you're perfectly fine. You've got a bit of grit in your right eye. We'll sort you out. On the way back, when we were traveling through Vauxhall Station, this was the very first thing I saw. I was behind Darth Vader, but I was at the back of him, and he was from the floor right up to the ceiling, and he was stomping but it was silent, as Judith said earlier on, no noise. And I thought, what the hell? So I actually hunkered down, I slid down a wall, and there was loads of people rushing around. And there I was with this giant Darth Vader, and I thought, what's happening? We managed to get onto the train, and then I started seeing disembodied heads sitting on people's shoulders. I think in about 2016, I made contact with Professor Dominic Fitch, and I actually joined his study, which was called SHAPED, the study of hallucinations in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, eye disease, and dementia. And at the same time, my friend's father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and he was talking to the family about black dogs and people on the balcony of their home, but they didn't have a balcony on their home. She was very distressed, and she phoned me up and she was talking about it. And I said, your dad's not, he's actually got CBS. And as Judith said, nobody knows about CBS, no doctors, no one's ever talked to me about it. Medieval land, well, that was fun. I was walking down the high street, and all the shops on my high street had lots of bowers with loads of flowers, but in the windows, I had Guinevere, I had Sir Lancelot, I had people in chainmail, all sorts of stuff. And I thought, well, I'm not sure if that's a good look in 2016, so I didn't go in. I couldn't get away from the medieval aspect. And I was closing my eyes, as a lot of people do. And the visions were still there. And I've spoken to lots of people. I did join Jonathan's support group. I'd been listening to In Touch on Radio 4, and Judith was talking, and Dominic Fitch was there as well, about Esme's umbrella and all these hallucinations. And I thought, good grief, that's obviously what I have. I have now got to the point where I have no use for vision. I only have light perception. And today, which is a very sunny day, is particularly bad for me, because what I'm seeing now is, I feel I'm living in a snow globe that's been turned upside down. And everything's just splashing and swirling at me. I can no longer cook. I can no longer bake. I'm a good cook. I'm a good baker. I can't do any of that. All sorts of things have happened that I just can no longer cope with, because I'm living in this odd world. I can put my hand through things as well. I may be smiling a bit, but some of the things Judith said, I'm just so tuned in with where she's coming from. Yeah, it's really, really tough. Now, medieval land went off. Then I started seeing pterodactyls. I was coming back from the gym, and there it came across the sky and flew towards me. So again, I hunkered down, put my hands up to get rid of it. I know these things aren't real. They don't frighten me, all the people I've seen. But it is very distracting, and it's very disturbing. And about 2 years ago, I had a bunch of people who turned up. I call them the boys. And it's, again, things that you've seen in your life. And it was Lawrence of Arabia. But it's, again, it's only head and shoulders, no body attached. There was the headgear and the mask across the face to stop the sand blowing in. And they turned up. And the first time I saw them, I was in the garden. And I was hanging out the washing. And I think they thought, well, we'll just come and see if we can help her. And there are a bunch of them. And their faces over the last few months started to morph into gargoyle type people. I've got used to them. I live with them, and I'll get up in the morning if they're there in the bedroom. Morning, boys, how are you? Or whatever. And a lot of us within the support group were talking about, you take it for granted because it's with you most of the time. And I know a lot of people find this very frightening. I personally don't. But I would like it to go away. I've clapped, I've done all sorts of things, and nothing has really made these people disappear. It's very misunderstood, condition. Nobody knows about it. Nobody's ever talked to me about it in a hospital. But I tend to talk to people because sometimes if I'm sitting with friends, I'm out for lunch, or I'm in the house, the boys turn up and I get distracted because I naturally look to the right or the left of people I'm with to concentrate on the boys, but they're not there. And I can't even see my friends. In reality, I can't see them, but I can see all these other people. I have tried to tell a few friends, but they just don't get it. People tend to not get acquired sight loss anyway. With Dominic Fitch's study, I was part of that for 3 years. People were coming to the house asking me various things. And I have actually documented a lot of my hallucinations and visions on my PC. I have access software, so when I'm typing anything, the computer will read to me. And if I get an email in or anything else, again, the computer reads. That's how I communicate. I think being sighted and having the physical attributes of looking like you're seeing people is a bit misunderstood, because people, first of all, don't think I can't see them. They don't accept it. And they certainly don't understand when you're maybe saying, oh, look, there's another pylon. And at one point, because I do, being Irish, have a sense of humor, I thought to myself, I need to find a jeweler, because I would love to have a pair of pylon earrings and a matching necklace. That might be a talking point, but in the main, people really don't get sight loss, and they certainly don't get what's been happening to us. I have found the support group, which Jonathan was running. I've been part of it for 2.5 years. A lifesaver, once a fortnight, to go into that Zoom call. And if people in that room who know where I'm coming from, and we do laugh as well about some of the things we're seeing. And you don't have to explain to people who are saying, I've got this huge black dog sitting in front of me now in my fireplace. And you think, oh yeah, I know what that's like. But what happened to me years ago, when I became visually impaired, I didn't know anyone in my age group. I had a 4-year-old kid. I was in my late 30s, and the people I were meeting with sight loss were much older. I started a support group with sensory impairment team, and we called it eye contact, because none of us could have eye contact. And one of the women in my group had been the head of an art school in London, and she had got macular, actually. And I used to try and support the people in the group. Social services would tell them about me, get their agreement that we could exchange numbers, and I would go and meet them for a coffee, have a chat, bring them into my group. I had 40 members eventually. I had 15 volunteers. I did fundraising in my local leisure centre. I managed to rent a room. Social services were letting people know who were newly diagnosed, excuse me, I'm still drink, with, I can't find the book, The Joys of Sight Loss. My husband's here, can you, excuse me a minute. And Dorothy was the lady involved, and she was a Yorkshire woman from Ilkley Moor. And I think she was in her early 90s, and her grandfather had been the local vet on his horse. And I took her out to lunch one day, and we were sitting chatting, and she said to me, I won't be able to come out and meet you for lunch anymore, because we did this, you know, infrequently. And she said, and I said, why, what's wrong? And she said, oh, I'm being sectioned in 2 weeks' time. And I said, what are you talking about? I've been to the doctor. I've told him I'm seeing all these people, these disembodied heads, whatever. And she was very wealthy, and everything was done privately. So the private psychiatrist got involved, went round to her house and decided she was completely, you know, bonkers. And that was it. And I said to her at that point, I reached over and took her hand. And I said to her, this is very emotional. I said, you're not going mad. You've got Shaw's Bonnet Syndrome. And I got involved with social services, and we went to see her and these doctors and all these people and explain what was happening to this woman. And they didn't section Dorothy, but I know 2 other people who have been sectioned because their families were adamant that they were barking mad. And it was quite something trying to get these people out of where they were, because they were perfectly sane. They were just going blind. And they got Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Anyway, that's
Thank
me.
you.
I just want to
Thank
say,
you.
Judith, thank you so much. And thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, Jen. And Jen, it's been great having you. And obviously, I spent a lot of time with you over the last few years, and so I'm very familiar with your story, and your story is very familiar, and I think is repeated by many people who came to the group, isn't it? So, as Jen said, I got to run or host the group for the last 4 years, probably at the idea of Judith. So one of Judith, and if Judith has an idea, then usually people have to follow it through. So that was good. So I hosted the group. We had people from all over the world, all sharing very, very similar experiences to the ones that Jen did. My background is working as a rehabilitation, or now what's called a vision rehabilitation specialist. My very first person I visited in 1987, as I walked through the door, she said, "Can you see the fat lady?" And I said, "Which fat lady?" She said, "That fat lady." And then during the conversation, then it transpired. The next person I visited an hour later then described how he was seeing bars. So since 1987, I've been talking to lots of people who've been sharing their experiences of these silent, vivid hallucinations. And as Jen so eloquently described, they can take so many different forms. We've had people join the group who've actually seen sheet music in front of them, and those musicians could actually see them, could have played the music, and they can't see like Jen. They have very, very little or no vision, but they can see music and musical notes coming up in front of them. So the range of hallucinations has been there, and probably that. And as Judith said earlier, we were looking at positive ways to support people. And probably, as Jen said, what we found is just knowing you are not alone, and just having the ability to talk to someone who understands your situation seems to be one of the best ways forward. And that's it. I would say then I would say there are, and again, not for everybody, but for some people, that idea of distraction, it works really well for some people. And there's a small black speaker which we found very, very useful, which I can't say the name of because we'll have lots of people joining in throughout the webinar. So the small black speaker with a girl's name, you speak, and things like doing quizzes, meditations, all sorts of actually finding ways of occupying your brain are really useful ways of actually stepping outside or stepping away from your hallucinations. So that's really all I wanted to say. Just to follow up from what Jen said, and it's probably a really good place to start with the questions, Julian, I think.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just switched my mic on. Yes, we've had a number of questions, so I'll start with the first one on the list, which is, can you explain why it's a syndrome and not a disease?
Oh my goodness, what a question. No is the answer to that. It was when I first discovered it, it was already called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. I think probably because Charles Bonnet in 1760 documented what was happening to his grandfather, who was of sound mind, and he'd had cataracts and he was having hallucinations. Nothing happened till the 1930s or 1950s, possibly, when another Genevan, Charles Bonnet was a Genevan, neurologist, had 5 patients with obviously Charles Bonnet syndrome, and he called it that then. So it's remained ever since. That is, I call it a condition when I talk about it.
So this is more of a comment, I think, than a question, but I'm going to read it out anyway. And it is, I was going to ask a question about movement. I have worked with a couple of people recently who experienced CBS primarily when in the car, on the bus.
Yeah.
So it's been brilliant to hear of a possible reason for this in terms of CBS linking that more lucid state, if that's the right word.
Yeah. Yes, that absolutely. I mean, it's because you go into a kind of slight trance when you're traveling, probably, and CBS loves that.
And another question, I'm not reading out people's names, by the way, to protect everybody's anonymity. So the question is, I see blue and thick yellow mist on alternative days.
Oh, yes.
And my doctor said, it's CBS. So no, my doctor said CBS is inconsistent. So is this really CBS?
Gosh, I am not a doctor. I have heard people talk about different colours on different days. I think the last time I spoke to Professor Dominic Fitch about this, which was only a few weeks ago, he said that he would call this CBS. A slightly different type. And I'm sure as we get to understand it more, we will discover there are different types. And I think this is one of them, because this is where distraction techniques don't help, because it's with you all the time. So people get pink days and blue days and yellow days, and they go very uniformly. So I think, yes, it probably is.
And I'd say just to add to that, Judith, that it's not uncommon, because I think over the terms of the group, we've probably had about 200 people through, and I've obviously met and talked to a lot of more people than that. And it's not uncommon for people to say that they see blocks of color or bright flashing, or just blocks of light or no light, and there is that alternation of almost like a green screen or projection that they see of nothing. So just blankness or blank color or looking through filters. So we had lots of people report that sort of
Absolutely.
report that sort of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. And it very often goes uniformly. So you will know if it's Monday, it's going to be blue. If it's Tuesday, the lady I spoke to not so long ago said she can go out on a blue day, but she can't go out on a yellow day, I think she said, because it's too bright, and therefore she just can't, it's all too much. So she makes sure that she has to do her chores on blue days, which she can luckily choose.
Okay, so here's another question. Is there any scope, or are there any developments for using assistive technology that currently being developed to detect the onset of an episode or hallucination?
Not at the moment. And until we do more research and understand much more about it, I don't think there would be anything that can tell, apart from the medical detection dogs, when an hallucination is about to appear. This is the problem, because some people actually quite enjoy it. They don't find it frightening. The thing that irritates them most of all is that they can never tell when it's going to happen. So it happens at the worst and most inconvenient of moments.
Yeah. So a number of people saying basically thanking Jennifer for for sharing her story. And here's another question. So, is there any evidence to suggest someone with a congenital as opposed to acquired sight loss can develop CBS?
Oh, yes. Anybody can develop CBS from any of the, I think, 130 eye diseases, I think there are, or from diabetic retinopathy, from optic neuritis, for when you have MS, from cancer, as I told the story of Miles, or any brain injury where the optic nerve is damaged. So it doesn't really matter what has caused the sight loss. It's the fact of sight loss that will lead to CBS.
and as you said earlier, Judith, from very young children as well. So
Yes, absolutely, from very young children. It's obviously slightly more difficult in children, because if they lose their sight before they have the words to identify what they're seeing, then you never really know, and that's awful, because then they will be crying for a reason that they can't explain. But but for the children that we have spoken to, who tend to be, I think the youngest I know about is a 6-year-old, although Professor Fitch tells me he has seen a 2-year-old. And the 6-year-old was laughing for no terribly good reason. And her mum said, "What are you laughing at?" And she said, "Well, I'm laughing at the monkeys because they're so funny." And then every day she laughed at the monkeys. And then she cried one day again for no reason. And her mum said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Well, I don't like it when the monkeys fight, because I can see the teeth and the claws and the blood." So,
and I guess what the question is also sort of driving at Judith a little bit is if someone is actually born with no useful vision at all. So I guess that's also part of the question as well. And I don't know if anyone's done any research or any looked at that particular issue, whether people can have Charles Bonnet-like symptoms if they've never seen at all.
Exactly. We will never know, because they won't have the words for anything. So they won't know what, if you are born blind, someone can just say to you, "Well, a double-decker bus is red," but you've never seen red, so you don't know how to describe it. So I don't know that yet, anyway, we will ever really know about that.
So next question. Do people with CBS always see images, or can it be associated with lights which look very bright and enlarged and seeing bright lights rather than images? Can CBS come on quite suddenly?
CBS can come on at any time when your brain decides to develop it, really. I know one person who had been totally blind for 6 years, no light perception at all, and suddenly CBS developed, and she said it was like watching the most beautiful gardening documentary. And so she saw colour again after 6 years. What the first bit of the question was?
So I think I can take that one. I think it was patterns. So certainly patterns, flashing lights. So anything. So patterns, flashing lights, cobwebs, bars. I've had people all sorts of dots. I think Jen talked about snowstorm earlier. All of these things. So it can be all sorts of visual interferences as well.
Exactly.
Now, I've just noticed there's quite a lot of questions that have been added into the chat, so I'm just going through them here.
I did notice one while you're going through, which I think her Zoom disappeared, and she was asking about what makes the medication that makes it worse. It was omeprazole, the proton pump inhibitor.
Okay, so yes, I have sparkling dots all the time. I have stars and dots, and I was told it was CBS. I think this person is asking, basically from what they're saying, is could this be CBS?
Probably is. I mean, neither Jonathan nor I are doctors, so you mustn't take. But we have spoken to so many people that we've heard all this many times before. So I would have said yes, wouldn't you, Jonathan?
I would say that, and I would always caveat exactly as you say, Judith. I would say if people have any concerns about their vision or anything to do with what they're seeing, they should always seek medical advice. I think it's a really something we should always say. Just it's always worth chatting to. And as you say, you've got and refer doctors and people back to your website where you've got that information. But I think people should, if any concerns, go back and see a medical person.
Yeah, that's right.
So another question here, is there any known correlation between cortical visual impairment and CBS in children?
Well, we have very little research with children, so I can't answer any of those questions. The very initial piece of research that Professor Maria Musaji did, I think the majority of the 13 children that she discovered had talked about seeing things that weren't there, which had been written into their notes, but the doctors did nothing at all about it. The majority of those, I think she said, had Stargardts. That's all. That's the only piece of information I have, because there's no research. We haven't done any yet, because research is incredibly expensive. So if there is a multi-millionaire out there who would like to put some money into research, please would you let me know?
So another question, is it possible for physical trauma, is it possible that physical trauma could cause this head injury of some kind, I think?
Yeah, a head injury, yes, a physical trauma, which causes a head injury which damages the optic nerve. So stroke, for instance, is something which damages the optic nerve, and then you lose some sight, and then you develop CBS.
Yeah, so any visual disturbance, really, isn't it, Judith?
Yes, anything which kind of damages or interferes with the optic nerve and the optic pathway.
So another question, is there a degree of vision loss that CBS tends to start at?
We used to say over 60%, but Professor Maria Musagi has done quite a lot of work on this, and she said to me, no, let's just say a variable amount of sight loss. Every single person is different. Some people only lose a tiny amount and it kicks in, and other people have to lose almost all their sight. Or as the lady I mentioned, she lost all her sight and was without CBS, and then 6 years later it kicked in. Why? We don't know.
I'm going to struggle to pronounce this, but I'm going to give it a shot. I developed what I believe is CBS the moment I lost my peripheral vision. Anonymous.
Oh, yes.
Hemiophilia.
Yes, that's from stroke.
Yeah. Is this what happens? It never ever changes. Constant flashing lights and occasional rainbow colours and blue squares.
We can't say. There's nothing that enables us to say whether CBS will remain with someone for the rest of their life or whether it'll go away. Sometimes it goes, sometimes it may get worse if you're ill. It may get worse if you're very stressed, but there's no way of knowing. I wish I could wave a magic wand and tell everybody, don't worry, it'll all go away, but we don't know. We don't know.
Another question. Do people who have sight loss from birth ever experience CBS?
That was the similar question earlier. We don't know because they will not know what anything looks like, and probably unless they've had a tiny bit of sight, there's probably nothing in the memory bank of images for the brain to use. But we really don't know. No research being done.
Okay, so a question, I think this is a more general question, which is, can I put forward for more disability champions to promote various disability conditions and engagement meetings? Shall I answer that?
Yes.
Yes, the answer to that is yes. So if you have anything that you would particularly like us to discuss, because we are always looking here at the University of Wolverhampton, particularly during Disability History Month, to raise awareness of conditions, particularly conditions like Charles Bonnet syndrome, for instance, that don't have an awful lot of awareness, to create precisely that, more awareness and understanding. So my email address is j.j.gwinnett, and that's GWINNETT @wlv.ac.uk. And please send me an email if you have anything to discuss in terms of something you would like us to consider, and I will be happy to get back to you. And I'll put my email in the chat as well to share with anyone who wants to contact me after today's event. So there's quite a few more questions here, actually, so I'll just carry on reading them out. So my next question is, have there been cases of people born black, blind, experiencing CBS, or is it people who have had vision before it deteriorated? I think that's kind of similar to the question you answered earlier.
Yeah.
And I understand there is mild and severe forms. Could you clarify what is mild and what is severe?
Well, I suppose that depends on who's experiencing it, really. I mean, it's very irritating anyway, even if all you see are, I mean, Jonathan talked about musical notes. So some people see musical notes or words or numbers or maps, which are not frightening, or beautiful flowers. That's not frightening, but it does kind of get in the way of everyday life. I think we would say patterns are probably at the beginning. Now, what we don't know is whether it will go on to develop into something much more frightening. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Again, no way of saying. But I suppose severe is Jennifer has it all day, every day. And there are many more people than I realized when I started that actually do have it all day, every day. And I think that would be considered severe.
And I think for me, Judith, when it's something severe is when it starts to actually interfere with what you want to do.
Yes,
So
which
so
actually
if
could
you-
be something
so if
quite
you-
simple. Yeah,
So if you want to sit down and eat your dinner, but you can't do it because there's things moving around on it, or you
exactly.
want to cross a road, but you can't tell whether the
Yeah.
car's coming or real or not real, or whether
Yeah,
that I think is, it's when it starts to
exactly.
interfere, those are things that you stop, going about your
Yes.
daily business.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So next question I can see, and I do apologise if I miss anybody's questions here. It's brilliant that so many of you have got so many questions to ask about this today's talk. So the next question I can see is, I see a child who sees shapes on the wall, particularly in the mornings. Could this be a form of CBS?
I assume the child has some form of sight loss. Yes, I think it probably could. And the reason I say that is that I know someone who has CBS all day, and she describes it as having a sheet hanging in front of her onto which are projected images. So I think it's possible, but I think you need to take the child to an ophthalmologist and a pediatric ophthalmologist and just double check.
Okay, next question. Are there any training formats currently available to promote the condition, or any campaigning on this subject?
Yes, me. I will train anybody who wants to be trained. And yes, campaigns, we're campaigning all the time. On my website, there is one particular campaign for GPs. If everybody could please go onto the website, download and print and sign the letter to GPs and take it to your GP and give it to them, that would be an enormous help. There's I do quite a lot of lobbying. And as I said, next year it's going to be lobbying Parliament because it's ridiculous that the NHS is doing nothing. So yes, I mean, I've been entirely on my own since I started, but I've had wonderful help from people like Jonathan. But we are growing a little bit. So I now have 2 assistants, 1 day a week each. First of all, TPT, Thomas Pocklington Trust, is funding one, and the Powell Family Foundation is funding another. So I think I will have more time to lobby, and we are creating campaigns all the time. So if you want to join us, whoever that was, please do.
Yeah, I've noticed an awful lot of people have actually been adding in the
Be able
chat.
to say something, please, Julian?
So, of course.
Go on, Jennifer.
I've tried to explain to friends. I just describe this as visual tinnitus.
Yeah.
It's just going mad all the time. Today's very bad for me, but it's, people talk about got tinnitus. This is visual tinnitus.
Yes.
Anyway.
It is. It is. That's good description.
Okay, so another question: is there a way of detecting the nerve damage? I'm assuming that relates to CBS that's caused by some form of head injury or trauma.
No. You mean how much nerve damage before it kicks in? Again,
Yeah.
it depends. It's the sight loss. that will determine CBS or not. Not everybody gets it.
So somebody's written, do I need to get diagnosed with this? My doctors know about the flashing lights after my stroke and vision loss, but have never diagnosed CBS.
Well, I suppose you don't have to. I would love people to be diagnosed, because then we will get some proper data. But again, you may have to take the information from my website to your GP.
But it's incredibly hard to get an official diagnosis in the UK.
It is
isn't it,
very
Judith?
hard. An
Very hard.
ophthalmologist will do it. A neuro-ophthalmologist and a neurologist should do it, and so should a psychiatrist. But it's very difficult to get them to do it.
Okay, another question here. We hear about hallucinations being of people from quotation marks, the old days, like from Victorian days or soldiers. Is this something that is changing and people are now seeing more modern figures because of their age?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because what tends to happen is if a person, a human, is hallucinated, that human is almost always in costume of some kind. Medieval, military, Edwardian, always with something on the head and something kind of long and flowing. And I mean, I think people see children running around possibly in kind of usual modern dress, but on the whole, they report costume. We don't know why that is. In fact, if you ask someone who lives in sub-Saharan Africa, they would describe something similar, except obviously they wouldn't say Victorian or Edwardian, but they would describe something similar, and we don't know what the brain is doing. It's very strange.
So next question, is information about CBS included in the resources for the curriculum framework for children with visual impairment?
Is this the one that Guide Dogs is doing? It is now, but it's taken me a year to kick them into touch. Yes, there will be, I hope, information. It will at least be mentioned. So yes.
Right. Okay. That's it as far as the chat's concerned in terms of
Great.
questions. An awful lot of questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wait, one last one I can see in the Q&A, which is, have you met anyone who had CBS which got better and they stopped having visual disturbances?
Yes.
Me
Yes.
too. Me too.
For some people, it goes away, but not for everybody.
And one other question, I've never had full sight loss, so my CBS takes the form of the partial sight I had in the past, and I cannot be, and it cannot be anymore. I think that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think we're going to end there, and that's a huge amount of goodwill and brilliant response today. Thank you so much, Judith, and to you, Jennifer, as well, and to Jonathan for helping us to put together such a wonderfully informative session, and to shine a light on some condition not many people have been aware of, but hopefully, thanks to all of your amazing efforts, many people will do so now.
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.